people did not run. They stood with their faces lifted, and the rain stitched coolness into their foreheads and wrists, left a damp thread behind the ears, and disappeared with a courtesy that felt like a promise rather than a tease. And then one morning, the river remembered itself. It did not come back with noise. It arrived like a thought that had taken the long way home. First, the wells felt different, lighter, like voices about to laugh. Then the ground near the bank grew damp and stayed damp when the sun rose. A tiny mirror gathered in a shallow place where reeds had been drawing lines in the sand, with wind alone. The mirror widened, joined another, then another. A child's hand dipped into it and came away jeweled. By noon, the first proper ribbon of moving water showed its wrists. By evening, boats lifted slightly as if relieved to remember their purpose. Relief did not break the day open, it loosened it. Jars moved through rooms with confidence of their old routes. A cloth, fully soaked, was draped over the lintel, and a cool air passed from one side to the other, as if the home itself had begun to breathe more deeply. Bathing was unhurried, almost ceremonial, not as an apology to the dry days but as their companionable conclusion. The first long drinks quenched more than thirst. They quieted the mind's vigilance. That subtle alertness, that scarcity had trained into every thought. But the memory of dryness remained, and it tutored gentleness. Even in plenty, water was poured as if it could hear. Shade was improved rather than abandoned. Cool corners kept honored. Pathways of morning and evening preserved like beloved songs. For the desert had taught a lesson that abundance alone cannot teach, that life is held snugly between careful hands, and that carefulness has its own kind of joy. When the flood season finally arrived in its fullness, it felt like a completion of a long sentence spoken softly. The water rose to greet familiar stones. Fields accepted its cool weight without protest. Houses watched their reflections widen. Children learned new games involving the edges of puddles that would soon become pools, then disappear again. Those who remembered dryness taught those who did not. Be generous when you can. Be patient when you must. Be quiet often, and let the river speak in a voice that belongs to both feast and famine. And in the years that followed, small practices endured. Bowls still waited outside at night to court you. Jars still found their favorite corners. Mats still hung at just so angles. Linens were still shaken in the morning light to remind them that air is also kind of water, subtle, invisible, but capable of cooling the pulse and smoothing the brow. People still woke early to gather whatever the day made easy before it began to harden its terms. At noon, when everything slowed again, as it always had and always would, the town rested with the trust that had been earned grain by grain, drop by drop. You might find yourself on such a day, standing where the bank curves gently, and watching the river behave as if it had never left. The water has a way of carrying forgetfulness that is merciful. It does not insist on the memory of thirsts, but the body remembers, and it transforms memory into craft, into the angle of a jar placed to keep the night. The way a door opens only so far, the habit of pausing at the threshold to see if a breeze might want to enter first. You drink calmly. You let your breath follow the water's line. You say nothing aloud, and yet everything in you says thank you. At night, the rooftop becomes islands again, but now there is a different patience in the air. The heat lifts more easily. The breeze travels in longer sentences. Someone tells a story about the time when jars were counted like stars. Someone else tells a story about a flood that climbed so confidently that boats tied themselves by mistake. A child falls asleep before the end of either story. the two braiding into a single dream that feels like walking along the bank with hands trailing in water that never runs out. Lamps burn low and need less tending. Crickets begin their intricate mathematics. Somewhere, a night bird negotiates with the darkness in a voice that no one argues with. There is a sacredness to the smallest gestures. The sip offered to a neighbor before the cup is returned to your own lips. The splash given back to the earth at the start of a meal. For luck or for memory, or for those not present, the dampened edge of a cloth held to a child's forehead, cooling the places where dreams gather. These are not luxuries. They are declarations that water moves through a people as much as through a riverbed, that it carved kindness into them, leaves behind deposits of patience and ease. On a different morning, long after scarcity had loosened its hold, you wake to a particular quiet that belongs to a generosity fulfilled. The river moves with a confidence that does not need to be displayed. The banks are alive with reeds telling each other what the wind already knows. A potter removes a damp cloth from a bowl that has rested all night and finds it supple, ready for the hand's persuasion. A woman lifts a jar from its nook and marks the coolness on her palms, then pours a cup for herself and then another for someone who has arrived without knocking. The day opens like a door already halfway ajar. You can imagine the desert, beyond the river's authority, still stern but not cruel. It is a teacher who does not change its lesson but sometimes change its tone. It asks you to move slowly, that you choose shade when you can, that you keep water as if it were an honored guest, and when you do, it gives you its gifts, silence to rest in, horizons that stretch the heart, nights with stars like small patient fires. Water runs, then rests, then runs again. The desert remains, the people remain. And between them, a treaty is renewed every dawn with no signatures, only footsteps in hand and breath. If you listen, you can hear how everything had learned to speak softly. The river does not roar, it sighs. The houses do not shout, they gather, holding cool and shade like secrets everyone already knows. The jars do not clutter, they settle, as if finding the note that belongs to their clay and the room they serve. Even the children, even the animals, seem to respect the volume of this place, which is set, always, for comfort. You let your shoulders lower. You notice how the air on your skin has weight of a hand that reassures without needing to hold. You are ready to sleep, or to wake, or to wait. Ready, that is, to live in a landscape where waiting is a form of wisdom, and water is what time looks like when it remembered to be kind. And now the night has taken its place over the desert, white, complete, and untroubled, wrapping every rooftop and palm frond in a shoal of silver light. The air is cool on the skin, warmer where the body rests against the earth, and the two sensations meet somewhere in the middle, like the joining of a quiet river and a still lagoon. The sound have grown distant, fewer voices, longer pauses, and the kind of silence that does not press but invites. Somewhere far away, a boat glides without urgency, the oar dipping and lifting in a rhythm so slow it could almost be part of a heartbeat. A dog sighs, the reeds whisper, and the moon keeps it steady watching over the sleeping homes. The last lamps burn low, and the stories of the day have found their ending places. Walls hold their coolness and readiness for tomorrow. Jars stand full in the corners like patient guardians, and mats lie smooth beneath the weight of those already dreaming. In this moment, nothing is needed. The desert is at rest. The river is at rest. You are at rest. And as the breeze moves once more across the quiet rooftops, it carries away the final fragments of wakefulness, leaving only calm and warmth and the unbroken thread of sleep. And yet, in the deep hours of night, long after the last voices had quieted. The river's absence was still a memory that the people carried in their bones. It was there in the way they turned in their sleep, instinctively seeking the cooler side of the mat, in the way mothers' hands, even in dreams, made the small practiced motion of shielding a child's face from the sun. The desert does not erase its lessons simply because the river returns. It teaches in layers, pressing them into the body like they are part of the way a person moves, part of the way a person thinks. Even the Nile did flow again. It was met with reverence, not celebration. It was not in their way to shout at abundance. They welcomed it with the same steady, measured gestures they had used when it was scarce. Women filled jars, not to spilling, but to the familiar line where the shoulder meets the girth. Children were sent with small vessels to carry to elders, not as a novelty, but as the renewal of a duty. A man knelt to wash his face at the bank, cupping the water first to his forehead, then his lips, then letting it run down his arms as though clothing himself in it. The work of replenishment began quietly, like the first notes of a song that the whole village already knew. Fields were fed again, but not greedily. Channels opened only as far as needed. Gates lifted to let the water wander, then lowered before it could run too far from the place where it was most required. The people had learned the weight of each drop in the dry months, and they were not quick to forget its worth. It was in the market that change was felt most keenly. The air was once again spiced with the freshness of herbs kept green with morning waterings, mint, coriander, dill. Baskets of cucumbers gleamed faintly where dew had been brushed across them before sunrise. Fish returned to the stalls, their scales throwing silver light like coins from the river's depths. Merchants called out not in urgent tones, but in the friendly cadence of those who expect the market to last all day without fear of goods withering in the sun. Yet alongside the abundance, there remained a quiet discipline. Bread was still baked in smaller loaves, partly because the habit had settled in, partly because it allowed each to be eaten fresh. Water was still stored in the same cool corners, still poured slowly, still carried with the same care from place to place. Scarcity had not been a season to survive and forget. It had been a teacher, and the people chose to keep its lessons. The animals sensed the change as well. Goats waded into the shallow edges of the river, nibbling at reeds now green and tender. Oxen stood knee-deep in the cool water, tails swishing lazily at flies, their eyes half closed in the long contentment of relief. Even the birds seemed to return with fuller voices, herons stepping deliberately in the shallows, ibis gathered in loose, easy groups along the bank. The air seemed stitched together by their calls, threaded with the hum of life restored. As days passed into weeks, the rhythm of life found its balance again. Work began in blue-gray quiet before sunrise, when the river reflected the sky's first light and the air was cool enough to make even heavy labor feel possible. Men mended nets along the shore, their fingers weaving rope with a rhythm that matched the slow lap of water on wood. Women walked to the river's edge to wash clothes, laying them across warm stones to dry in the softening sun. Children splashed in the shallows, their shouts carrying across the water, answered now and then by the distant call of someone's name. Even so, there were places where the memory of dryness lingered. Certain wells still held only a shadow of their former depth. The walls inside, pale and dry, where the water had once marked its steady line. Farmers still watched the river with a practiced caution, measuring its height against familiar stones, reading its mood, and the way its surface caught the wind. The desert had a way of reminding them, sometimes through a hot wind that smelled of faraway dust, sometimes through a horizon that shimmered just a little more sharply than usual, that nothing here was promised forever.